Noon hour, everybody out there in Zoom land. My name is Marissa Shu. I'm an extension educator with University of Minnesota Extension. The focus of what I do is help work with farmers and gardeners and pesticide applicators about how they holistically approach dealing with insects, diseases, and weeds. So a huge part of that is identification, knowing what's actually going on with your crops so that when issues arise, you have a good diagnosis and you can make the right decisions to deal with it. That's kind of been the theme this month. We talked about pumpkins last week. We'll talk about tomatoes this week. And next week, we'll talk about holistically approaching managing weeds. Today, super narrow focus, tomatoes. Tomatoes, super popular crop, can be a super profitable crop, but can also be a crop that has a lot of problems. I think of some diva vegetables as being things like tomatoes can be a little bit of diva, celery 100% a diva, cauliflower a diva. Tomatoes can have lots of different problems associated with them, especially in terms of physiology. So mismatches between how tomatoes grow and the nutrients they need and what the Minnesota environment is giving them, as well as some pest issues. So that's going to be the main focus of what we talk about for the next half hour. So I don't, if you have a phone that you can like search tomatoes and you can find all the pictures of ugly tomatoes that you've taken in the last year or two, might be a helpful reference as we go through this. So we're going to focus primarily on issues caused again by physiology, disease, and nutrition. Those are the three biggest causes of issues we see in Minnesota tomatoes. They're different than the pumpkins we talked about last week, where generally like pumpkins are good at light. Pumpkins like to grow. Pumpkins are pretty tolerant of a lot of stuff. They get some diseases, but not as many as tomatoes. Well, tomatoes, they get few bugs, lots of disease, lots of physiological issues. And we'll sort these by how often we see them in Minnesota. So, our two main causes of tomato problems. First, physiology. So, when we talk about physiology, we're talking about the process of plants functioning. So, the processes of growth, of photosynthesis, of water movement, of nutrient movements. And when there's mismatches between the water, the nutrients that the crops are demanding and what the environment is allowing for, that's when we start to see things like blossom end rot, leaf roll, yellow shoulders. And we see these the hotter the summer is, a lot of plant processes get messed up when it's hot outside. So we'll talk about those issues. And we also see more of these issues oftentimes as we grow in high tunnels and our high tunnels get older and older and older. That can lead to all kinds of nutrient buildup, salt buildup. And when we have that happening in combination with heat, all kinds of really funky things can happen with our tomato plants. Our other main problem causer in our tomatoes is going to be plant diseases. These often appear as leaf spots, leaf yellowing, roots that instead of being white and firm are off color. Maybe they're brown, maybe they're mushy. Maybe that we can pull the plant out of the ground entirely if these get really bad. So when I think about plant diseases, instances, growing seasons where you have lots of tomato plant disease, any plant, one, any summer where it is not a drought, we're just going to see tomato disease. Some of our tomato diseases I think of as being a fact of life when growing in Minnesota. So we'll talk about those. But anytime we might see a higher occurrence of tomato diseases, anytime we have high humidity, big fluctuations in daytime and nighttime temperatures where we have lots of dew, years where it gets tons of rain. So there's a lot of sitting water, a lot of splashing water that creates conditions where it's really easy for pathogens to move around and multiply. Then anytime we're not rotating, be it because we're in a small garden where it's really hard to not put tomatoes in the same spot every year, or we have a high tunnel where it's really hard to make the economics worth of putting anything else in there but the tomatoes that people love to buy. So these issues, there's a lot of them, and they can be really hard to tell apart. So as we think about, okay, things are wrong with my tomatoes. Things will go wrong every year. How do we make diagnoses in the season instead of hearing about them as it snows outside in mid-February? Scout regularly. So check in on your tomato crops once a week. Take a close look at the plants. When we do see issues, take pictures, take notes. Note, where are you seeing? Is it just in the high tunnel? Is it just in a low spot? Is it just in one variety? That's going to help you sift through all the different things we talk about today and figure out what's actually my problem. Other things to think about: what is the weather like? How am I pruning these? How am I staking these? Am I using fungicides? Other important stuff that will help us figure out what's going on. Finally, look at the individual plant. Where are these leaf spots? Are they new growth, old growth? Is it all growth? The leaves are discolored. Is it the new growth that is turning yellow or the old growth? Stuff like that can seem like fine details, but like the diagnosis will be hidden in the constellation of all those fine details. Another reason scouting is important is because it helps us catch these issues when they're early. That helps us diagnose them easier, but also take the right actions so that we manage them effectively. Oftentimes in tomatoes, think of the example of blossom end rot. When blossom end rot first happens, it's pretty, most people have run into blossom end rot. The butt side of our tomatoes are brown, not well developed, mushy, unmarketable. If we catch that right away, like, yeah, it's easy to see like my tomatoes have a brown spot on the blossom end. It's blossom end rot. If we don't catch it right away, it's really easy for opportunistic pathogens to move in and cause the whole tomato fruit to look down. This looks really alarming, but the root cause is the same as the tomatoes over here. So catching things early, easier diagnosis, potentially less stress, and the chance to actually manage whatever the problem is. So let's get into our tomato problems. This is going to be a little bit of like a murderer's row of maybe things you've had go wrong in your tomato production over the years. So we'll talk about causes and potential prevention and management as it is or is not available for these different issues. We'll start with blossom end rot, maybe the most classic, common tomato problem. Some varieties super prone to it, some growing conditions super prone to it, and even if you're doing everything by the books, this will still show up sometimes. Plants, tomatoes, again, they can be a little bit of a diva. They can get everything they need and still do stuff like this. So blossom end rot, as the name implies, it is a rot that is occurring on the blossom end of the plant, not caused by disease, caused by a mismatch between the nutrients that the growing tomato fruit needs and what the plant is able to access and move around. So blossom end rot is driven by calcium. Calcium is a nutrient that is very common in Minnesota soils because of the bedrock we have in our state, because of the water sources we have in the state. Calcium availability is generally not a problem. Most Minnesota soils are pretty high in calcium. The plant needs to take up calcium from the roots and it needs to shuffle it to the developing fruit. And this can be really, really hard for the plant to do. Calcium needs water to move around, like all our nutrients, but calcium really needs the water. It needs a regular, steady supply of water to be moved around. When I think about calcium, I think about like high school, one of my least favorite academic experiences of all time, high school chemistry, where you have to like do the diagram where you like are charting like Ca and then you put it in a circle. You have to draw more circles on, you like plot the atoms that like cause the molecule to have a charge. If you think back to that, like calcium is a molecule that is big, chunky, and has like a +2 charge. That means it is a molecule that is hard to move around because of the way it is structured at like the atomic elemental level. So it needs water to move around and it needs a really regular supply. It's hard for plants to move calcium around, especially when fruit can be growing at a really, really rapid pace. Our tomato crops, they use a lot of water. The reason we have a big, juicy tomato is because that juice comes from water. So tomato water demands will increase as the season goes on. And once tomato fruits start forming, there's a huge jump in the amount of water that our tomatoes need. So if they're not getting enough water, fruit won't develop well for lack of water, but also for the lack of the calcium that the water will help move to those rapidly developing fruit. A big driver of water movement and usage in plants is transpiration. So the process of plants losing water as on the edge of the plants, there's little holes, the stomata, and in high heat conditions, high light conditions, low humidity conditions, water is going to be stripped out of the plant. If water is available from the roots, it will move up the plant into those leaves, but also into the fruits where the calcium is needed. If there's not enough water, that process isn't going to happen as efficiently, and it's less likely that those developing fruits are going to get the calcium that they need. What can make blossom end rot more common, especially in soils that get tons of compost or maybe are in a high tunnel where it's like a desert in there. There's no leaching of nutrients because we target where the water goes in a high tunnel. And so we're not getting those soils. The soils aren't getting leached out. Nutrients can really build up at high levels in there. And so sometimes we can have soils where there is enough calcium and enough water, but we still get blossom end rot. This is because I think of it being kind of like the the roots of our tomato plant are like a parking plant, are like a parking lot, maybe like a really aggressive parking lot. I live in the Twin Cities. I think of a tomato root as being like the very aggressive parking lot of a Trader Joe's or like the St. Louis Park Costco for true for true heads. There's limited parking space in our tomato roots, and it's competitive to get those parking spaces. There are other nutrients in the soils, things like magnesium, things like potassium, phosphorus, stuff that wants the same parking spots our calcium does. But they can hog the parking spots. Our tomato fruits can be developing up there, they can be getting the water they need. But if there's not enough parking spots for the calcium to sit and enter the roots and join the water and go up to the fruit, the calcium won't be available to the plant, even if it is present at high enough levels in the soil, because there's just simply not enough sites on the roots where the calcium can be taken up because other nutrients that might be overabundant in our soil, because again, of a lack of leaching, because of the addition of too much compost, those other nutrients that maybe the plant doesn't need as desperately are hogging the parking spots. What are we looking at our soil tests that let us know maybe this is part of our issue? We have to do soil testing is super important, and things to look for are the presence of cations. Calcium is a cation, one of the reasons it's so hard for plants to move around, but things like magnesium and potassium also are cations and can be those parking spot hogs that can keep your crop from getting the calcium it needs when it needs it. Whenever we talk about blossom end rot, I get questions about can we foliar feed calcium? It's not super effective. That is not the main thing we want to be doing to tackle our blossom end rot. And again, adding more calcium is oftentimes not the solution. Do a soil test and you will probably see there's adequate calcium in your soils. So what can we do about blossom end rot? One, check in with your variety. We will talk, I will say check your varieties so many times in this talk, but there are some tomato varieties that are just prone to having these physiological problems. A lot of the times there are heirloom varieties. Heirloom varieties are historical varieties that maybe didn't make the cut for commercial production because they have these physiological issues. Maybe with great flavor and great beauty, sometimes comes a little bit of this diva behavior. Beefsteak varieties tend to be really prone to it. And generally varieties that are super, super leafy, they're going to be having super high levels of transpiration, lots of water needs. It's going to be trickier for the calcium to get where it needs to go in super leafy varieties. Other things that can help with managing blossom end rot, making sure we're applying nutrients according to a soil test and university nutrient recommendations, making sure we are giving a very consistent supply of water. So not watering um, you're like one plants need an inch of water a week. Ideally, we're not giving that all in one big drench. We're giving it a little bit every day so the water supply is consistent. When we do get fruit with blossom end rot, and again, we can be doing all this stuff right, and blossom end rot will still happen. It's very common for the first flush of fruit in a tomato crop to have lots of blossom end rot. As soon as we see it, get it out of there. That fruit is never going to be marketable, so don't let the plant waste its time or energy on growing and ripening this fruit that we're never going to be able to sell. Okay, next issue we're going to talk about, also kind of a physiological one that was mentioned in the chat as being an issue, fruit cracking. This can appear as cracks on the stem end of the fruit, or in some varieties, some years we'll see it more as this zippering, or not zippering, what is it called, growth crack type, where it's almost like concentric rings of cracking. This is not a disease problem. This is also a physiological problem that can lead to all kinds of other problems. If these can scar over, and some markets might still accept them, but these provide an easy access for all kinds of pathogens to potentially get in the fruit and cause it to rot. So what causes fruit to crack? A lot of it comes down to the elasticity of tomato fruit flesh, which can be influenced by all kinds of factors. I'll say variety again. I'll say hot weather, amount of available moisture. All that's going to go into what the elasticity of any given tomato fruit's skin is. When we get huge influxes of water, which again are becoming increasingly more common in Minnesota with climate change, we're seeing a pattern of super hot, dry period, huge influx, like multi-inch rain event, really hot and dry again. That's perfect conditions, unfortunately, for fruit cracking to occur. That huge influx of water, it's going to be hard for even the most healthy tomato plant to have enough skin elasticity to deal with that huge influx of water. So variety is a huge determinant in the skin elasticity. I feel a little nuts saying skin elasticity so many times on a Zoom about vegetables, but here we are. So characteristics of varieties that don't crack, or that do crack. Generally, varieties that produce fewer large fruit are more prone to cracking. I saw people in the chat talking about beefsteak tomatoes, love love to crack. Varieties of the really thin skin, which can be make them more palatable. It's less, I don't know, if you don't like that chewy, gummy skin when you're eating a tomato, that can be bad for varieties and ones that crack. Varieties that put all of their eggs into one basket. So varieties that produce a few huge fruit generally are likely to crack. And then on an individual plant, varieties that are exposed to direct sunlight. So varieties that are maybe pruned aggressively or just less leafy in general, that lack of shade is going to reduce that elasticity and increase the chance that tomatoes crack. So how do we deal with this? One, check your varieties. If you're like, I have issues with this variety every year and it's getting to the point where I think I'm losing money, try out some other varieties. There are ones that are less prone to cracking that might be a good option for your farm. You don't have to go whole hog into a new variety, but try a few plants here and there in similar conditions to see if they're cracking the way your old unreliable variety has been driving you nuts. We want better cracking than that. Generally want slow, uniform plant growth. So that means, again, nutrient management, making sure plants get the right amount of nutrients. Also, our watering practices. We want, again, consistent moisture instead of huge influxes. We might not always have control of that. Again, a lot of our huge influxes are coming from rain events, but we might be able to tweak our watering schedules to provide this consistent water that fruit need. Another thing we can potentially do is tweak the time when we pick our tomatoes. So if we're able to harvest tomatoes when a breaker stage, a pink stage, get them off of the fruit so that there can't be a huge rainfall event while they're still on the vine getting fully ripe. Pick them a little bit before that when they're still ripe but have a few days to go. Will ripen up in storage and not be susceptible on the vine to these huge influxes of water. One place you can go whenever you're looking for things like varieties that don't crack or just varieties that have disease resistance that do well in high tunnels. One place that is an interesting place to dig around in is called the Midwest Vegetable Trial Reports. This QR goes to it here. This is an annual publication put out by Purdue University, but people across the Midwest who are trialing vegetables for all kinds of different things submit their reports in here and they're published. I saw Charlie Rauer, one of our pumpkin researchers we have at the University of Minnesota, he submits a lot of his work to this type of journal or publication. The stuff is really short. Usually they're 3 to 4 pages. Oftentimes they include pictures. And there have been trials specifically done that are in this variety report bulletin. Some of the results highlighted here that look at things like tomato fruit cracking. A lot of the stuff that's being looked at is in direct response to grower questions and concerns. So it's fun to look at seed catalogs, but if you're like, okay, how do I actually narrow this down and make a decision? This can be a great place to go to look at reports and cross-check and see what yields and performance have been like for different vegetables in our region. Next fruit issue we'll talk about is zippering. This can look somewhat similar to growth cracks, but generally we see this a little bit earlier in the fruit, and the patterns are oftentimes different. So it's zippering almost like running north to south on the fruit, almost like a zipper. So you can see here we have these scabbed over kind of streaks running north to south on the plant with almost like the teeth that we'd see on a zipper on a coat or on a vest. The zippering is also a physiological issue, but caused by very different factors than the last two we talked about. So when we look at what people who study vegetables think cause zippering, they think it is caused primarily by cold snaps when fruit are very, very early in development. That when tomato flowers are forming, when there's a cold snap and the flowers are still developing, that causes parts of the flower to fuse together. So the anthers are fusing to that newly forming fruit, which causes, as the tomato fruit grows out, that zippered appearance. So what can we do to prevent zippering? One would be just keep an eye on unheated growing spaces early in the season. It's in high tunnels, you can get away with planting things much, much earlier than you can outside. But if that space is unheated and plants are coming along nicely, and then there's a cold snap where that house gets pretty cold, that can be the kinds of conditions where you can get a lot of zippering on the fruit set that result from the flowers that are present during the time of that cold snap. Again, if we're seeing a lot of zippering, try a different variety, see if it responds better to the same growing conditions. Another fruit-based disorder that is also related to cold and heirlooms is going to be cat facing. This is one of the more fancifully named tomato problems where you get scabbing, oftentimes on the bottom of the fruit, but you can have it on the top of the fruit as well. That I would love to see one that actually looks like a cat face instead of like a kind of weird misshapen scab on the fruit. But allegedly, this looks like a cat face to whoever got to name this specific plant problem. This one is also tied back to what is happening at the flower at the time of flower development and fruit formation. Generally, we think these are caused again by cold disturbances way before the fruit is actually present on our plants. So there's a cold snap before the flower even opens. So really early in flower development, that is what physiologists, vegetable horticulturists think is part of the cause of cat facing. So again, something we might not even have that much control over, though we might have some control over depending on if we have a high tunnel and we're choosing when to plant out our tomatoes. Other causes that have been studied and potentially linked to cat facing would be the plant stress caused by excessive pruning, excessive amounts of nitrogen that can cause the plant to grow at really uneven rates, as well as some heirloom varieties are super, super prone to this. If you've grown heirlooms before, you've probably seen fruit cracking and you've probably also seen cat facing. For some customers, cat facing can be seen as kind of like a charismatic, fun part of heirlooms, but it can also make the fruit much harder to handle and store. So, our dealing with cat facing, kind of a fact of life. Check out other varieties. Last physiological issue we'll talk about that we see in Minnesota with pretty good regularity is going to be leaf roll. So I'm sure if you've grown tomatoes outside, you've seen this. Weather turns hot, all of a sudden tomato plants start to look like crap because all the leaves have rolled up on each other. This can be really alarming. It can happen really fast, but in reality, it doesn't matter that much to the plant. Plants can have leaf roll and still yield totally fine. So this is something that oftentimes gets attention, raises flags, but luckily does not matter a ton for us as growers. So I'm trying to figure out, is this leaf roll or is this something else? Plants that have physiologically caused leaf roll, the leaves will still be green. They will still be a deep, uniform green color. They might have a little bit more of a tough, leathery texture than we might expect, but they'll still be uniformly green. The rest of the plant may look fine. So we're not going to see distortion of the new growth. We won't see any stunting. The plant is still the same size. New growth looks fine. Older leaves are just kind of leathery and curled up. This can happen very fast, and it oftentimes happens in the lower half of the plant. So some of our other things that can cause things that look similar to leaf roll, they don't start in the old growth. They start in the new growth, and we'll talk about those at the very end. Stuff that looks like leaf roll but isn't. But generally, if we're talking about lower half of leaves suddenly all curl up like a cheese, like a cheese roll up that you'd make in the microwave. Think physiological leaf roll and go on your merry way because you don't need to worry about this. Okay. Okay, we'll close out by talking about the two tomato diseases that are kinds of a fact of life when growing in Minnesota. These will happen every year to some level, no matter how careful you are. We'll start out with early blight. So when people talk about tomato blight, there's two tomato diseases with blight in their name, and early blight is the main one we see and worry about in Minnesota. This is caused by a fungus that lives in the soil, survives in plant debris, and moves around with splashing water. So when we have soil where we've grown tomatoes before, there's probably some early blight fungus in there. When it rains, we get splashing. So the water hits the ground, splashes up with some dirt in it, and mixing with that dirt is the fungus. Fungus hits the leaf infection starts. These will first appear as brown spots on the leaf, and as the disease progresses with humidity, with moisture, the leaf spot will grow. So we'll have a brown spot. Oftentimes the area around that brown spot will be a light yellow color. And if we look closely at that leaf spot, we'll see a series of concentric rings, almost like we'd see if we were looking at a tree stump. These lesions, they'll progress, they'll grow into each other, and eventually you'll kind of have the plant leaves curling up, dying, brown, crusty, crispy from the ground up. Super common disease in Minnesota. Happens all the time. We're thinking about preventing early blight, things we can do. One, at the end of the growing season, make sure we do what we can to remove tomato materials from the growing area. If we can't do that, trying to get them like chopped up and integrated into the soil to encourage the breakdown of the infested plant matter. Another important thing to do is to rotate. Ideally, we want to be rotating our tomatoes to a new spot every 3 to 5 years. The longer we can do, the better. That's going to reduce the amount of the fungus that's able to survive in the soil and move around via splashing the next year. Moving into the growing season, what can you do? One, add a mulch. Any kind of mulch, plastic mulch, living mulch, straw mulch. All these are going to help reduce the amount of splashing that we have and prevent that action that allows the fungus to hopscotch up onto our leaves. Another helpful thing we can do is prune, stake, tie, all that stuff. Moving the foliage upward, we're allowing airflow to get into those leaf canopy, keep them dry so it's harder for the fungus to get established and to spread on the leaves. Another disease we see basically every year in Minnesota that oftentimes like comes hand in hand with early blight is called Septoria leaf spot. This is another disease that, as the name implies, looks like spots on the leaf, but they look a little bit different than our early blight spots. These will occur on the stems and on the leaves, and we'll see a spot that is tan in the center, dark brown on the outside. And these oftentimes stay pretty small. Just the number of them will increase until like the leaf is totally covered in spots, shriveled up, and dead. The prevention for this is incredibly similar to the way we manage early blight. So cleanup, rotation, working on airflow, pruning, staking, tying, all the same stuff works on both of these diseases. If these are a major issue that you are dealing with on your farm year after year, we also have lots of really effective fungicides that work on both of these diseases. If we want to learn about what those are, the Midwest Vegetable Guide is the place where we go. So I'm going to switch where I share my screen quick so we can take a look at this guide. Hello, everybody. Go into screen. This one. Okay. So if you go to that website, again, it's mwveguid.org, you will end up at the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. This is a resource that extension people from across the region work on together, and it includes the results of pesticide trials and research done at 8 land-grant universities in our region. When you pull it up, it will look like this. You can use this guide as a hard copy. You can order a hard copy online from some of the other universities in our region, and you can also get this whole ginormous 308-page guide as a PDF if you wish. If you just want to learn about tomatoes, you could download just the chapter about dealing with tomato problems. So really helpful if you like printing and you like PDFs. If you don't like printing in PDFs, this is also available as an interactive website that we can use a couple of different ways. So for example, we could hit pick my crop. We could say we're growing tomatoes. And then we could say we're dealing with, let's see if Septoria. Here we go. We're dealing with Septoria. It will then think for a little bit, but then it will populate a list of fungicides that have labels and work well in the Midwest on Septoria. So for example, here, it's our Septoria page. We have a little bit of information about what the pathogen does, how it works, how often to spray for it. It includes some information on controlling this without using fungicides if we're not someone who wants to spray anything. And then it will have a list of pesticides that if you click one, it will tell you a little bit about how to apply it, the reentry interval, the pre-harvest interval, how risky it is to pollinators. It will give you a lot of that high-level information that might help inform you about if this is a product you're interested in using or not. We always have to read the label. The label is the law, but this is a great place to get a high-level idea of what pesticides are available for the commercial grower that work well in our region. And I'm going to switch over to ye old PowerPoint. Yeah, great resource. Anytime you're thinking about actively managing a pest, maybe doing a spray, great way to learn more about products way quicker than a label is going to allow you to. And it's updated more than annually. Whenever stuff changes, people go in and update it. We'll close out with one more tomato leaf disease, but unless you are growing in a high tunnel, you will never experience this disease. This pathogen, this disease is called tomato leaf mold. We only see it in tunnels because this pathogen likes super, super high humidity. Like, yes, Minnesota summers can get very humid, but this pathogen specifically requires like 80, 90% humidity, which we only get in enclosed growing spaces in Minnesota. How this disease appears is the top side of the leaf will have kind of these yellowy, undefined areas, but if we flip it over, you will see these very distinct olive colored, really like fuzzy to the naked eye spores. If you see that, that is your like dead ringer that it is tomato leaf mold. This is a really hard disease to manage. It is super, super genetically diverse. And so that means that if we're talking about using fungicides or using varieties, sometimes the methods through which those work only apply to some of the strains of the disease and not others. So they can be part of the equation, they might not be the whole equation. The biggest thing we can do here is work on reducing humidity in our high tunnel. So making sure we have gable vents and some of the stuff Natalie talked about in her like designing a high tunnel webinar, making sure there's vents, making sure there's fans, making sure sides are up, making sure doors are open on hot, humid days. Those are going to be super helpful for a lot of reasons, including for preventing this disease. Okay, so now, oh, I see some chatter in the chat about the Midwest Vegetable Guide and does it have organic options? And it does. There'll be filters on the side where one of the boxes you can check is OMRI listed. And if we have, again, it's products that have been trialed in our region and work. So sometimes the OMRI listings, especially for plant diseases, can be pretty slim because we just don't have that many effective products for a lot of our plant diseases. But when we do know there's something available that works, at least some to most of the time, it will be in there and you can filter for it by checking OMRI listed on the left side. Oh yes, thank you for liking that, Charlie. Okay, so now we're going to go into some every so often problems. So maybe problems that don't happen on every farm or in every garden every year. One that we're seeing, maybe not every year in Minnesota, but increasingly are low tomato yields or really delayed tomato um, fruit production or ripening. And a lot of this comes down to when do we have our really, really hot periods in Minnesota? Like tomatoes, they're a warm season crop. They like warm weather, but only up to a point. If it gets too hot, the tomato just it sounds weird to say like the plant stops working, but the plant just doesn't work as well. Different parts of the plant's biology are affected by high heat in ways that can reduce the amount of fruit that are produced overall, as well as how long it takes for fruit that are developed to ripen. So, what do we know about how tomatoes respond to heat? So, all our tomato fruit, they come from flowers. We've already talked about these flowers are kind of sensitive to cold temperatures in terms of zippering and cap facing, but they can also be sensitive to hot temperatures. So our tomato flowers, if we think about them on the plant, they have a lifespan of about 50 hours. That's how long they are open, available for pollination, period of time when fruit can get pollinated and start to develop. And we know that these tomatoes, they have temperatures where pollination is probable. We also know that if it gets really hot, the biology of these tomato flowers change and it becomes less likely that they're going to be able to set fruit. Tomatoes also really like variations in day to night temperatures. Those swings are part of what sends the signal to the plant to ripen the fruit. So when we have really hot nights in the summer, we will see a delay in flowering because the flowers are less likely to be produced. The pollen is sticky, so it's harder for it to move from one part of the flower to another. And then it's hot at night, and so flower not work. Tomato fruit don't ripen very well if we're not getting those swings from hot day to cool night. The other thing that can make it harder for tomatoes to get pollinated and form fruit when it's hot out is pollinators. A lot of bee species do not like it when it's above 90 degrees out. When it gets really hot, honeybees, they'll stay at the hive and they'll all work together to like fan and air condition their hive. And even our native bee species are not as active when it's really, really hot out. So not only is our flower producing fruit or pollen that is really, really sticky and less likely to get pollinated by wind, the bees who might aid in pollination and moving around that extra sticky pollen, they're staying home. So the last few years when we've had a really, really hot period, which like I think it was last year, at least in the metro, it was very hot during like peak tomato flowering and fruiting. It was really hot then, which had this cascading effect of just less tomatoes later in the season. And what can we do about that? Unfortunately, very little. There is research going on around the United States about honing in on some of the variety differences. in how they behave when it gets really hot out, but we don't have really great variety recommendations for super hot weather. Another thing we can see that is also tied to levels of or times of year when we have really hot weather and really direct sunlight is going to be sun scald. So just like us, if we go out in the sun on a very hot, very bright summer's day in Minnesota, our skin can get burned if we have tomato fruit that suddenly get exposed to really bright, hot, direct sunlight. Their flesh can burn as well. This can appear as yellowing, or it can get so extreme where fruit is potentially damaged. So, sun scald is going to happen oftentimes if it's like fruit or a tomato is super leafy. We go in and we tie and we prune. Tomatoes suddenly exposed to maybe a level of sunlight they aren't used to, and we're in a period where we have really hot, intense, direct sunlight. Um, we know from studying tomato physiology that when tomato fruit get this direct sunlight, they get really hot. That will start to cause them to yellow, and above really higher temperatures, tomato temperatures in the hundreds, that's when we start to get that tissue death that is more likely to render a tomato fruit unmarketable because it will develop this tan area that starts kind of flattened and tan that will eventually get infected by all kinds of opportunistic fungi that will cause the whole fruit to melt down. If we're thinking about preventing this, choosing varieties that produce leaves, being really thoughtful about how we care for the canopy. Like, yes, we need to have airflow, but we don't want to leave the fruit with like the bare minimum number of working leaves. We want to try to keep our fruit shaded if this is an experience, a way we've lost a lot of fruit in the past. Next issue we'll talk about is called yellow shoulders. If you grow in a high tunnel, this is potentially an every year issue for you and is primarily one we see in high tunnels in Minnesota. Yellow shoulders is when the kind of blossom end of the fruit stays yellow. It never gets ripe, never changes color, no matter how long we wait. And oftentimes, this yellow tissue area is kind of it's hard, doesn't have a ton of flavor, pretty impalatable. What causes yellow shoulders is kind of complex. It is kind of an area of hot debate among people who work in vegetables. Factors that scientists believe are linked to yellow shoulders include hot weather, so temperatures above 90 degrees, hence why we see this more in the high tunnel where things again are hot. And we also think there's a component where it's driven by plant physiology. So interaction between the variety, the nutrition, and what nutrients are available or not available, and other causes of plant stress, in particular plant viruses, seem to be linked to increases in yellow shoulders. The fact that we don't understand this problem super well makes preventing it and managing it really, really hard. General recommendations, if you're seeing a lot of yellow shoulders, unfortunately, a lot of it comes down to variety. So if you have a variety that currently has a lot of yellow shoulders, trial something else. In some seed catalogs, you will see tomato varieties advertised as having a uniform ripening gene. This gene is thought to be linked to reductions in yellow shoulders. So if you're like, how do I pick which variety to trial next? Maybe one that has these genes that help the tomato fruit ripen all at one time. We also want to make sure we're putting in healthy transplants, in particular transplants that are not already flowering. Again, that's going to increase the level of plant stress and increase the chances that we deal with not only yellow shoulders, but all kinds of basically every physiological issue we've talked about in this webinar. We also want to make sure we have enough potassium. Potassium is super important in tomato fruit development. Tomatoes use a lot of K, so we want to make sure there's enough of it. But this can get more complex because, again, this is one of our cations. It's like our calcium, where if there's tons of calcium, tons of magnesium, tons of potassium in the soil, they're all going to fight each other for limited parking spots that are going to get them up to the developing fruit. Generally, we want plants that are healthy, so we're soil testing, we're watering at a consistent level, and we're not over fertilizing. So sometimes, easier said than done, especially in a high tunnel that we've had for a long time. These are all little bits of the equation for reducing the chances that we deal with yellow shoulders. Okay. I've talked a lot about nutrient stuff in this webinar. So this is a parking lot moment to say tomatoes are super heavy users of N and K. They love nitrogen. They love potassium. Tomatoes remove tons of those every time we grow them in a space. So if you're like, okay, she keeps talking about like, make sure you soil test and give stuff the nutrients. University of Minnesota has vegetable nutrient recommendations. You can find them at this link. That will help you combine with your soil test, figure out how do I amend my soil in a way to give my tomato plants specifically nutrients they need because they have different nutrient demands than some of our other vegetables, especially in terms of the amount of potassium that they use. Now we're going to talk about just some general nutrient deficiencies. So we have some that, lost menrot, pretty distinct, manifest in a very particular way, basically everywhere. But not all of our deficiencies and issues are as guaranteed or as something that maybe we'll ever even see as we grow. Natalie Hoydel did a really interesting study where she went to 100 vegetable farms all around the state, tested soil in high tunnels, tested soils in fields, and there was also that were like a lot of vegetable farms have plenty of nutrients available to their plants in their soil. There can still be mismatches between the nutrients tomatoes need specifically and what is actually available in our soil. So we'll talk about a few just general nutrient deficiencies as they look and appear within foliage primarily. When we're trying to do any type of diagnosis, but especially nutritional ones, key things to look for and look at and think about are where is the damage we're seeing? Is it new growth or is it on old growth? Some nutrients that plants use are mobile, meaning that if the new growth needs this nutrient, they will strip it out of the old leaves and send it to the new ones. Other nutrients, they are immobile. They are like stitched into the fabric of the plant. No matter how bad the new growth needs it, they're going to have to find it somewhere else than within their old leaves. So, depending on the nutrients you're looking at, some manifest as only in new growth when there's an issue, some manifest as only in old growth when there's an issue. When you're trying to diagnose nutrient deficiencies, you also run into a lot of jargon. So you'll run into words like chlorosis and intervenal, which we'll explain in the next few slides. But knowing those words will help you make the diagnosis and sift through different extension resources related to nutrient deficiencies. So when we're seeing nutrient deficiencies in leaves, there's a couple things we tend to see. One common symptom of a couple different nutrient deficiencies is chlorosis. This is a fancy word for leaf is turning yellow. There's not enough chlorophyll in the leaf is breaking down. There's not enough nutrients to support that chlorophyll, so the leaf is no longer green because it's no longer has enough chlorophyll to like do photosynthesis anymore. So when we see chlorosis, that just means leaf is yellow. Plant pathogens can cause this, but if we're seeing very uniform chlorosis or yellowing throughout a leaf, that is a sign of a nutrient deficiency. Another word we commonly see when we're looking at resources or trying to make a diagnosis about nutrient deficiencies is going to be intervenal. This just means in between the veins. So oftentimes you'll see intervenal and chlorosis together, and that translates to the veins, they are deep green, they look normal. The areas between the veins, the intervenal area, looks yellow. That's where the chlorosis is. Another word we'll sometimes see when looking at stuff around plant nutrient deficiencies is necrosis. This just means like death. Leaf is dying. So leaf is getting crispy, leaf is getting dry. But most of our nutrient deficiencies are intervenal or involve chlorosis. Necrosis, much less common. So some common nutrition issues that we see in Minnesota, not all the time, but occasionally. One would be nitrogen deficiency. This is one where the symptom is chlorosis, so uniform leaf yellowing. If it's extreme, the veins will also be lighter in color, but if it's more mild, we will just see the veins are dark green, in between areas are yellow. Another nutrient deficiency we may see is phosphorus deficiency. This appears a little bit differently. It will appear as leaves look super, super purple. This is oftentimes caused not by a phosphorus deficiency. In fact, in that 100 farm study I mentioned, basically every vegetable farm in Minnesota has just so much phosphorus, more phosphorus than the plants could ever need. So oftentimes when we see phosphorus deficiency in our plants, it is because it is early in the season, we just planted a transplant, and it is cold outside. Those are conditions where it's just really hard for plants to get the nutrients they need. When we plant a transplant, for the first few days of that plant's life, all those roots are still going to be in that little clump of soil around the transplant. It takes them a little bit of time, a little bit of water, a little bit of heat to get their roots out of that clump of soil we planted them with and start to explore and take nutrients from outside of, the little chunk of soil from the transplant tray. So in those first few days, especially if it's cold and it's wet and it's hard for those plants to grow and advance their roots, that's when you can start to see phosphorus deficiency. Sometimes starter fertilizer might be the solution. Sometimes the solution is just give it a day or two. The forecast says it's going to dry out, it's going to warm up, and oftentimes this type of phosphorus deficiency will take care of itself. Another common nutrient deficiency we see only in high tunnels typically is going to be magnesium deficiency. This will appear as interveinal yellowing, especially amongst the oldest leaves in the plants. And sometimes this will come on kind of quickly as the plant starts to set fruit. This just comes down to those fruit, the process of setting fruit is super stressful on the plant. It asks a lot of the plant. So as fruit start to develop, oftentimes we see this magnesium deficiency start to happen at the same time. Our soil test might tell us if we have enough magnesium or not. And this is also, again, it's part of that trifecta of cations along with calcium and potassium that are all trying to enter the roots through the same pathway. So it might be not enough magnesium. It might be too many cations fighting for too few parking spots on the plant root. Another somewhat common nutrient deficiency, we see it in high tunnels, but I also have gotten reports of this from outdoor. I've gotten this in my own garden. Is a condition called, oh, what is this called? Internal whitening. So it will be you have a fruit that looks beautiful on the outside, you cut it in half, and there's these white, fleshy, they're really chewy, don't taste like anything. They're quite unpleasant to find when you cut into a tomato. These are primarily driven by a potassium deficiency, which again, common on some farms, not common everywhere. Finally, we'll close out with our two occasional plant disease problems that we see in tomatoes. And those are going to be our bacterial diseases. There are two major bacterial diseases we see in Minnesota tomatoes with some regularity: bacterial spot and bacterial canker. Bacterial spot sounds like what it looks like. It will appear as black spots on the foliage, even in the young transplants, but it also will show up in older leaves and will also show up in fruit. There'll be small black spots kind of all over the plant. Bacterial canker gets its name from a tendency it has to cause cankers in the stems. So stems can get these yellow lesions that eventually split. So it doesn't always look like that. It can also just look like leaf yellowing, or sometimes it will appear as you have a leaf and half of it is yellowed and withered and the other half looks healthy. That's another thing that bacterial canker does. So these diseases are a little bit different in appearance, but they're very similar in the way they move on the farm and stay on the farm. So all of our bacterial diseases, so bacterial spot, bacterial canker, are super, super moisture driven. Bacteria need water to reproduce, and they need water to move around. The way they primarily enter the farm is on infected seeds. So if that tomato seed was harvested from a plant that has a bacterial pathogen, the bacteria can be tucked away on the seed coat of that seed. When we plant it, the bacteria will infect the plant kind of from birth, and you'll have a problem plant all summer long, unfortunately. It's also really easy for these bacterial diseases to make a run for it from one infected seed to everything in a transplant tray. Transplant trays are super wet environments, super humid environments, places where we're hosing. So it's easy for a bacterial pathogen to move around as we water a huge flat of tomatoes, for example. So when we're thinking about managing bacterial diseases, prevention is a huge aspect of it. So if we've never seen these before, we want to keep it that way. So we want to make sure we're buying seeds from reputable sources. Companies know that these pathogens are a problem. So they will do seed lot testing, or they'll divide their seeds into lots. So we'll say every 1,000 seeds, that's a lot. We'll then test some seeds from every lot to make sure they don't have bacterial pathogens. If those 5 seeds we take out to test, if they have a bacterial pathogen, we're going to throw away the whole lot. If they don't have a bacterial pathogen, we'll sell them. So this is not a foolproof way to guarantee you will never run into these, but it really does reduce the chances. If we're not starting seeds ourselves, buy transplants from a reputable source. So check in with them. How do you scout your transplants? Before you plant, the transplant tray you've received, check in on it. If you're seeing stuff that looks like this or like this, don't plant them. Bacterial diseases, they don't get cured. They can get less bad if you luck out and it's not a super humid Minnesota summer, but that's a risky gamble to make. So don't plant transplants that have these symptoms of bacterial disease. Another important thing to consider is that, again, these move with water. So anytime we have moisture splashing around our plants, but anytime, maybe we're pruning and those pruners are wet, it's easy for the bacteria to hitch a ride from one, for pruning tomatoes in a hoop house. It's something we're doing like all the freaking time. And if we prune an infected plant and then go on and prune its neighbor with those same pruners, that pathogen is going to make the hop from the infected plant to its neighbor thanks to our intervention. So remove infected plants, clean and sanitize tools and hands that are touching a lot of plants. We're going to close out by talking about some more rare tomato problems, but something that we do see and get reports of every year. These are not physiological in nature. They are diseases or they are like people-based problems. The first is going to be tomato viruses. Tomatoes are host to a lot, unfortunately, of plant viruses. So there's maybe 5 we commonly see in Minnesota. These viruses have a lot in common. They're oftentimes vectored either by insects or by people. So again, the same pruners that might accidentally move a bacteria from one plant to another, they could also potentially move a virus from one plant to another. What do plant viruses look like when our plants have them? Plants will, at a certain point, all the new growth will just start looking super messed up. So the plant will start to look, the new growth will look shrunken. It will look twisted. It will look curly. The leaves will look tie-dye. They'll look totally warped. They'll be curling in all these mangled, ugly ways. A lot of times plant viruses result in the creation of really interesting and very symmetrical patterns within the leaf. So, for example, here are what some mosaic viruses are, what we call them. It almost looks like to make these almost look like crop circles that are like embedded in the leaf. And this is because, again, there's a plant virus circulating within the leaf, messing up the cells, messing up the DNA. So we get these, again, shrinking, distortion, very tie-dye, perfect circle, alien-esque spots in leaves. And we can also see these types of symptoms in fruit. Fruit will get bubbly, warped, tie-dye in appearance, and oftentimes they're not going to be marketable. Here's what these plant diseases look like more at the whole plant level. So you can see there's all of a sudden this point where the plant got infected somewhere in here. The old growth, to stress out plants, the old growth doesn't look great, but it doesn't look like this. It doesn't look like silly string instead of an actual tomato plant. Here would be what this looks like more at the field level, a healthy plant compared to a tomato plant with a virus, where we can see twisted leaf distortion, pretty extreme. And plants like this, they will like stand out when you're walking through a field. So if you see stuff like this, check in on it. And if you see anything vaguely like this, if you suspect a virus, remove it because it's really easy for a single insect to pick up this virus and then go feed on the neighbor and then go feed on the neighbor and spread a virus through a whole field. Last thing we'll talk about, and I think this is the most, all these things suck. They're all painful to deal with, but I think herbicide injury is like the most heartbreaking tomato issue. Tomatoes are super, super sensitive to a drift from a lot of herbicides that are commonly used in turf and ornamental settings, but also in like field crop production settings. They can look very similar to viruses. A lot of them cause leaf yellowing, a lot of them cause distortion. But we'll talk about what the 2 most common ones look like here to help you get an idea. So if we suspect we have viral injuries, one helpful thing to do is to step back and look beyond the tomato field. When we have drift events, your tomatoes would be affected, but so will the plants at the border of your field. The nearby vegetation may also be impacted. So if everything looks a little bit twisted, a little distorted, a little crispy, not just your tomato plants, but maybe the sumac tree that is in the ditch nearby, if that also looks messed up, that is a flag for like something's going on here. Our tomato viruses, they just affect tomatoes. Wild plants will look normal. Herbicides, they will affect the wild plants as well as our crops. Each specific herbicide has specific symptoms that it will cause our tomato plants to demonstrate. Here we have glyphosate injury. So the active ingredient in Roundup, or what was historically called Roundup. Now Roundup is a brand name that has all kinds of active ingredients in it. But glyphosate is something, again, that is in turf settings. So if you grow in an urban area, in a suburban area, you can run into this. But this is also used in corn and soybeans. So if you grow in a more rural area, you can run into this. Glyphosate injury will appear as the new growth will start coming out super, super bleached and yellow. So you can see that pretty clearly on this plant here, where at the time of exposure, everything that is new growth after that period of exposure is distorted, is so bleached, it's basically white. It's not even yellow anymore. And all the new growth is uniformly showing this. Another common herbicide group that we see in Minnesota, and again, um, there are formulations of this that are very common in lawns and used by lawn care companies and in corn and soybeans would be herbicides that are called growth regulators. The way they kill weeds is by tweaking with the way weeds grow. And unfortunately, they also tweak with the way our tomatoes grow. This will cause new growth, the whole tomato plant, honestly, to look twisted, distorted, curled, totally bonkers. So this looks really similar to some of the plant disease. Those virus pictures I showed, they look very similar to these herbicide injury pictures. That's where these get really tricky to diagnose. And that's where it's helpful to look at the neighboring plants and neighboring non-tomatoes and see, are those guys twisted and messed up too? If they are, there's a chance it might be herbicide injury. The only way to confirm herbicide injury is to do testing. If you do this independently, quite it's quite expensive to do, and there's a lot of nuances to doing it. If you hope, and the only thing you can do if you get herbicide injury is like, if it's confirmed, you're going to be limited in your ability to sell produce off infected plants, and your only like way of potentially becoming economically whole is unfortunately like finding the drifter and doing like legal action against them. And so that is where like getting a confirmation from the MDA is really our only pathway. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture has a tip line where you call in, like, I think I was drifted on, and they will send out an investigator who will look at the site, take samples. They will do analysis on those samples to look for herbicide residues, and they will come back with paperwork either saying like, yes, this was drift, no, it was not drift, and then you are left from there to decide if you want to like enter the legal process. So this is something that happens in Minnesota every year. Not everyone will experience it, but it really is really tricky if you do experience it. What a note to end it on. I should have ended on a less despairing note. But in summary, we talked about a lot of stuff today. So if you're like, okay, how do I synthesize all of this and try to prevent all of these problems? Big takeaway is one, know what varieties you grow, where they end up, and if they're letting you down, trial something new. I think a lot of really sharp growers are always trialing a few varieties every year so that if one of their, staple varieties has an issue, they have something in their back pocket that they think could potentially become like upgraded from JV to varsity if the need be. Super important to soil test regularly and apply nutrients according to what your specific crop needs. In this case, according to what tomatoes need. Use seeds from reputable sources. Again, that's going to allow you to hopefully get some disease prevention, but also to use varieties that are well understood and are of good quality. As the season goes on, check in on your tomato plants once a week so that you can, catch a disease and get rid of an infected plant or start a spray program. And one big thing is also to take care of plants so that there's airflow, moisture is managed, leaves aren't sitting and wet, so it's harder for all of our plant diseases to get established and to move around. All right, that was a lot. That is my email. If you have questions that you think of later, I personally know I'm really good at thinking of a great question like 10 minutes after a meeting ends. But if you have any questions now, I will scan the chat and I will answer them. But yes, thank you for your attention to a kind of despairing webinar. Q&A. Oh yes, and if you could fill out this poll, I would really appreciate it. This webinar series is a new endeavor for our team. So if this is helpful for you guys, we'd love to know. If this is a flop and you wish we were doing something totally different, let us know. All comments, good and bad. help us. Our goal as a team is to have a program where Minnesota vegetable growers feel supported, feel they have access to resources, and your feedback helps us know if we're hitting the mark or if we need to take another aim at it. So always happy to have feedback from all of y'all. Oh, a question from Shane in the Q&A box. Which of the nightshade family members are at most risk for catching tomato disease, or are all of them roughly the same? So if we think about our kind of solanaceous crops that we grow in Minnesota, we have tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, and peppers. Of those, I think tomatoes are probably the most disease prone, then potatoes, then eggplants and peppers. They're generally less susceptible to both of the diseases, but they do have some that are a little bit more common and devastating. I think of nightshades in general as being one of the more diseasey plant families, but I think tomatoes are probably the most dramatically diseasey because of the how common septoria and early blight are. We have an anonymous person asking, is there someone to contact for the vegetable production guide? Yeah, you can shoot me an email. We can pop that in the chat, and I'm happy to help you get a handle on any part of that guide. Yeah, I'm Minnesota's rep for it, and I've been working on that guide for almost a decade now. So if you have any questions about it or having trouble getting things downloaded, just let me know at my email, and we can work it out, and I can dig up whatever it is you're looking for you. Okay, let's see. Other questions. Okay, we have another request for the Midwest Veg Guide link. I will post that in the chat again. Any questions you're seeing on your end, Lauren?
There's a couple questions about pruning.
Yes. Um, if you, I am not, I am more on the pest management side, so I know if you have questions about pruning, ask Natalie Hoydel specifically about the pruning. She is running a really intense high tunnel course right now, but part of that is teaching about tomato pruning, and they have hands-on elements where they are like going out and pruning tomatoes. If you have specific questions about different leader systems and how much to prune or not prune, especially in a high tunnel, email Natalie Hoydel about it. We can pop her email in the chat, but she has a lot of experience giving high tunnel tomatoes the like insane amount of pruning attention that they often desire. Okay, then there's her email in the chat for pruning type questions. Hmm. Yeah, so Charlie, yeah, you have tomato trials too. Charlie in the chat has, I'm doing a replicated mini pruning study on two varieties this year in Waseca, all branches below first flower or all but the uppermost branch below the first flower. Also, no pruning. So we'll have some more Minnesota information about this soon. We have a question about calcium levels in raised beds filled with different soil than what is in ground. Um, so you can test your raised bed soil the same way you could your in-ground soil. And since your raised bed soil is going to be working pretty hard for you and might have pretty intense nutrient demands on it, I would test that soil and check out where you're at. Though I will add that depending on where you're at, like lots of Minnesota's like municipal water systems, private wells, a lot of them are really pretty high in calcium. So you might do the soil test and discover, like, I started with a bagged mix that I don't know that much about, but I have calcium in the soil. Again, there's lots of calcium in Minnesota's water because of our geology. We have a lot of questions about specific tomato varieties. I know Charlie is hanging out in the chat. Charlie, do you have any tomato varieties that you like or have good luck with in Minnesota? I'm happy for you to come off mic if you are still in here.
Hi, does my audio work?
Yeah, you sound great.
Oh, uh, uh, I've grown Celebrity Plus in my garden and I love it. There was a study we did like in 2009 or something, and Perone came out. doing very well in that study. People liked how it tasted. It's an indeterminate variety that I don't know how popular it is, but that came out doing great.
Yes. And another thing I will add is that Midwest Vegetable Variety Trial Guide, there's a way to look at that where you just look at like all the trials that have ever been done on tomatoes. So you could just get like a murderer's row of like different tomato trials going back 20 years from around the Midwest. And that might be another place to look. Each one of those trials looks at slightly different things. So maybe there's a trial where they've looked at fruit cracking specifically. A lot of them are like, here's what the total yield was, here's what the marketable yield was, which oftentimes is sorting out the stuff that is cracked or cat-faced or zippered and unmarketable. So that'd be another place I would check out would be that variety trial report bulletin. Someone in the chat recommends Strawberry Field as a slicer they like. Answer line. Okay, I think we've gotten all the questions that I am. Oh, we have a question about indeterminate versus determinate tomato varieties for disease. Um, so one one place I like to look at when we're talking about varieties, a lot of it depends on like one, what disease do you have that you're trying to avoid? A lot of us, like, we will all deal with early blight and septoria probably, but some of us, especially those who have been growing in the same spot for a long time, might have some of like the more heavy hitter tomato diseases that I was not strong enough to talk about in this webinar. The link I just posted in the chat goes to a resource from Cornell University where they get their hands on as many variety catalogs as they can. And then they just check like what varieties are advertised at least as having resistances to different diseases. So this is like a quick and dirty way to be like, what is out there that might have a resistance or a tolerance, might do a little bit better with the disease I'm looking at. Looks like on that list there are, for example, 33 varieties that are advertised as having some kind of resistance tolerance to early blight, if that is a disease you're worried about. Um, if we are just trying to pick varieties of tomatoes that like we might deal with less disease, varieties that are short days to maturity. Days like I so they are like out of there before we get, the really heavy dews of late summer where like tomato disease is like at a certain point you just like gotta throw your hands up and just like let it go because no amount of pruning in the world is like going to stop some of these diseases from marching onwards once we get like the heavy dews of like late August, like tomatoes are just gonna have to call it at one point. The varieties that produce early um, can be really nice if you're really struggling. Um, and then it's hard indeterminate and determinate tomatoes. That's the way the fruit they produce, the way you eat them is so different. So it really just depends on like, do I want a big slicer for sandwiches or am I okay with I mostly grow indeterminate in my own garden and my sandwiches that have tomatoes on it, there's like sliced baby tomatoes that are like falling all over the place. So maybe some people want more dignity in their slicer tomato experience than I do personally. So a lot of it comes down to personal preference and what your specific disease problems are.
Marissa, did you get the one about the high iron irrigation water and if it would affect the calcium, phosphorus, and K? I forget which what that one is.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you know anything about that, Charlie? About iron and how it like relates to nutrient availability? Oh no, Charlie left because I keep calling on him. Oh
No,
no.
I'm still
Oh, there
here.
you are.
Uh, I don't know about that. I mean, iron phosphate can precipitate.
Yeah, that's true.
Um, hmm, yeah. I don't think the iron itself would be the issue necessarily. Usually most of the soils we have here probably have enough calcium and phosphorus.
Yes. Yes. More than your plants could ever use, honestly. All right. Well, I actually think we've addressed everything now. But if you think of anything else, My email is mschuh@umn.edu. And if I don't know the answer, I will shake the trees until I figure it out. So thank you guys for being here this afternoon, and I hope to see you all next week when pest month concludes with some talk about integrated weed management. All right. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your week. Stay warm now that the fall spring is officially over.